I want to welcome you to our walk through Romans. Now, I've said this many times. If you just listen to one of our podcasts, you know what? You might have a misunderstanding of what we're saying. You need to listen to all of them. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, he's just trying to get viewership. No, that is not my intention at all. I want you to understand the book of Romans. Now, we are over 100 podcasts now in the book of Romans. And you know what? It's so important that you go back and that you listen to each of those podcasts to get an overall picture of the book of Romans. You know, the book of Romans, I took Romans in college, and it was a 3 credit hour course. In other words, for 3 hours every week, I sat under the teaching of the book of Romans. Great Dr. Ron Walrode was, Dr. Carol Thompson was the teacher. Did a great job. Great job. But you know what? It took a long time. Now, let me say this to you. Go back to yesterday's podcast, especially, because today we're going to continue in Romans, the 8th chapter, verse number 11. Now, if you listen just to yesterday's podcast, you might get the idea that I believe that Jesus didn't die to heal our bodies. Well, we're going to clarify that today. This is what Romans 8, verse 11 says. But if the Spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead dwells in you, he who raised Christ Jesus from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies through his Spirit who dwells in you. The Spirit of God affects our mortal bodies. We need to get that into our understanding. We need to understand that the Spirit of God affects this mortal body. It brings life to this mortal body. Now, in verse number 10, we talked about yesterday, where it says, if Christ is in you, though your body is dead because of sin. You know what? We need to understand that eventually this body is going to die. Even the greatest men and women of faith, their bodies died. Now, let me say this. Here, the writing that Paul is doing, he's writing it in future tense. Now, there's some people that would say, and they would be right, but they're only partly right. They would say, well, that means the resurrection. And you know what? It does mean the resurrection. There's going to come a day when Jesus is going to come in the clouds, and those who are alive and remain are going to be caught up with those who have gone on before us. And you know what? We are going to have a new body. A new body. Whoo! The Spirit of God's going to go into that grave. The Spirit of God's going to rise up from the inside of the believers that are still here, and it's going to transform this old body of death, of sickness, of pain, of limitation, whatever. It's going to transform this body. It's going to happen. I know it's going to happen. I'm looking forward to it. I've got my hopes set on it. It's going to happen. But if you are just limiting the effects of the Spirit of God on something that's going to happen in the future, you're limiting what Jesus has done for you. Do you understand? The Spirit of God on the inside of you right now, while you're living here on earth, is affecting and can affect your mortal body. Notice what he says, going back to verse number 11, chapter 8, verse number 11. He who raised Christ Jesus from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies, your flesh, this body. That same Spirit can rise up on the inside of you and bring life. Let me just tell you a story. You might think, oh, he doesn't know what he's talking about. We were missionaries in the Soviet Union. One Sunday I was sitting in the audience and a lady on the front row died. She died during the preaching. Now, I'm not going to say it was because of the preaching, even though the preaching wasn't that good. She died. And very customary in those churches to have 3, sometimes 4 different preachers on a Sunday. And so in the intermission between the first preacher and the next preacher, they said, Leon, will you go and remove this dead body from the sanctuary? And I said, yeah, I don't really like touching dead bodies, but yeah, I'll take her out. And I took her out. And when I was carrying her out, a lady who was on our mission team, who was an RN nurse, she saw me carrying her out. And so she came out into the foyer with me. And we laid this lady on the ground. We looked at each other and we said, you know, what do we do? And she actually tested her. She opened her eyes and touched her eyeball. And she said, there's no reflection. There's nothing, no reaction whatsoever. This woman is dead. And all of a sudden I felt on the inside of me the Spirit of God rising up with this verse. And we looked at that dead body and we commanded it to come to life. You know what happened? 15 minutes later, this lady was up walking around and walked back into service. I tell you what, we had revival. It didn't depend on the next preacher's message. It was the Spirit of God that moved. It wasn't Leon. It wasn't this nurse. It was the Spirit of God that had an effect on a mortal body. Listen to me as we close for today. Allow the Spirit of God to affect and bring life to your mortal body. Not just in the resurrection, but allow it to happen today in your life. That's the will of God for you. Thank you for watching.